faced, first of all, this an extremely daunting challenge in terms of how much more powerful the Chinese military was becoming. A situation in which they had to be prepared to defend themselves, but also recognize that relying on the U.S. ultimately was probably the sort of optimal strategy for deterrence and defense, at least to a certain point. Also have, just Taiwan is now, of course, a thriving democracy and has its own domestic politics to contend with. And during the Chen years, it sure looked like divided government, meaning the DPP controlling the presidency and the KMT controlling the LY, meant that it was going to be very hard for for Taipei to kind of accomplish some of the defense goals that it had established for itself. Now, I think we can say that after looking at the Ma years, having your own party control the LY doesn't necessarily make things that much easier, maybe a little bit easier. But there are kind of institutional sort of checks and balances, if you will, that independent of which party is whether you have an opposition controlled or your own party controls the legislature is going to make for some challenging policy implementation. And then there's the reality that social welfare spending has increased in priority in Taiwan. That's as you would expect. And that there are trade-offs between spending in different categories of government spending, and that if you are a legislator, you might personally face a lot of incentives to support some programs and be less supportive of others. And generally speaking, supporting a lot of spending on defense doesn't really seem to be a particularly winning approach politically for legislators in Taiwan. In terms of furthering their careers as legislators, I think for most people it's probably a lot better for them to be on, say, the Transportation Committee than on the Foreign Affairs and National Defense Committee. Again, there are certainly exceptions. I mean, there are true defense experts among LY members who really want to be, well, I think there are some who really want to be on the, or have been over time at least, who really want to be on that committee. But by and large, I think it's fair to say that the sort of average member of the legislature will feel like their career is better served focusing on other things that deliver direct benefits to their constituents and help them get reelected, especially if they represent a geographic constituency as opposed to being an at-large legislator, which might maybe have a somewhat different set of incentives. But so there were all of these challenges, and so my conclusion was that you had to look both at how Taiwan, or look at several things. You have to look at how Taiwan interpreted the challenges posed by Chinese military modernization. You had to look at the degree to which Taiwan or the U.S. had more leverage on particular issues in the U.S.-Taiwan security relationship, and also take a close look at domestic politics in Taiwan to kind of understand the overall response. So, of course, this was a very challenging situation that persisted through the Ma years. And I viewed President Ma's strategy as essentially to try to have a stable and constructive cross-strait relationship to kind of increase Taiwan's serving of value to the international community, to have a strong relationship with the U.S. And he certainly had a lot of critics, but at the same time there were many people who argued that he had a very reasonable approach given the circumstances that Taiwan faced. Now, I won't try to adjudicate that dispute, but I think that's a fair characterization of his approach. And then, so with President Tsai entering office after winning the election last year, this, the basic situation is more or less what I've laid out here, which is over time the military balance has moved very much in China's favor. Again, not because Taiwan is failing to pay attention to this, the disparity in resources and the trajectory of Chinese military modernization over the years. I think, yes, it's certainly true that Taiwan's defense budget has been, most years has fallen short of the goal of 3%. But even if Taiwan spent 3% every year, or even more than that, they would still face the same basic situation. And so the challenges that President Tsai inherited are not, I mean, they're extremely complex. To kind of get into where her administration's defense policy came from, fortunately we have some clear guideposts to understanding what the DPP was thinking about during the Ma years, because the DPP, much to its credit, published a series of what they refer to as defense policy blue papers that really laid out in a pretty reasonable amount of detail their thinking about most of the defense strategy and defense policy kinds of issues that they would that they felt Taiwan was facing, of course, during the Ma years, and that they expected that they would inherit if they won the next election. The defense policy blue papers, I think, serve a couple of different purposes for the DPP. And so, as you go through and read them, it's worth keeping that in mind. I think one of them was to sort of show that the KMT didn't really, sort of own the national security issue in Taiwan domestic politics, but the DPP could also come up with, new ideas about defense strategy and be a, a serious governing party on national defense issues were they to win the next election. Of course, I don't think very many voters in Taiwan go to the polls really thinking about defense policy issues as the main thing that they're concerned about, but certainly analysts and policymakers in the U.S. pay a lot of attention to Taiwan's defense policy. So I think another objective of writing the defense policy blue papers and briefing them to a U.S. audience in particular was to convince people in the United States that the DPP would be prepared to govern not just on domestic issues and on cross-strait relations, but also to have a kind of coherent and sort of complete program for dealing with defense challenges if they won the election. I'm sure that I know that people from the DPP were well aware that on the U.S. side there were some doubts during the previous years, and that they felt like they'd been treated unfairly, in particular with some of the remarks that appeared in the Financial Times about their sort of preparedness to handle the cross-strait relationship. And I think they wanted to be sure that they would avoid that kind of outcome again. And so I kind of viewed the very really pretty impressive articulation of their thoughts about defense policy as partially aimed at avoiding that kind of problem in their relationship with the U.S. So I think there was an important international audience for what they were writing about too. But if you look at those defense policy blue papers, they they cover everything from kind of restoring the sort of full faith of society in the armed forces in Taiwan after the Corporal Hung incident, who was a military, was serving the military and was basically hazed to death, and then there was a scandal about how that was investigated and handled that actually resulted in 2 defense ministers resigning about a week or maybe 10 days apart. So part of it had that domestic focus, but a lot of it also addressed issues like how to improve Taiwan's defense industries, how to kind of optimize security cooperation with the U.S., how to think about Taiwan's defense strategy and try to make it more the kind of buzzwords at this time and to a certain extent still today were innovative and asymmetric. Meaning to have to kind of adopt innovative approaches to dealing with a more powerful adversary on the other side of the Taiwan Strait. Asymmetric meaning not to try to match developments in Chinese capabilities sort of one for one, but rather to come up with ways to leverage Taiwan's strengths to exploit Chinese vulnerabilities, essentially. And so these papers also address things like the program that is still underway to try to move toward having a volunteer service system for the military, which has proven very difficult in Taiwan's case, as it is in a lot of countries that try to make this transition. So these papers, again, I think provide a pretty good roadmap for understanding, where those of us who focus on these issues in the U.S. at least, where we expected President Tsai to go after she came into office. Now, I think they also served one other really important purpose that has mostly been overlooked, and that was sort of cultivating a talent pool so that when the DPP again had an opportunity to govern, they would really have a sort of deep bench, as we would say, of people who were knowledgeable about defense issues, and not just at this kind of senior level who had experience from the Chun years, but also kind of younger analysts and experts who would be able to help them formulate and implement defense policy. And so I think there is clearly some value there as well. So now that President Tsai is in office and Taiwan's Quadrennial Defense Review has just come out, which of course, I sometimes wonder if maybe Taiwan tries to emulate too many things from the United States. I don't know anyone who's worked on a U.S. QDR who's enjoyed it or found it particularly useful personally, but obviously it serves an important institutional purpose, and the idea in Taiwan also is that it's mandated that I think it's within 10 or 12 months of a new president taking office, they have to produce a Quadrennial Defense Review that sort of lays out their policies and strategies, and again, provides some sort of at least at a kind of high level, some guidance for the next 4 years of Taiwan's defense planning. So if you look at the QDR that came out a little bit earlier this year in traditional Chinese characters, and then maybe a month or so ago in the English translation, I think you get a very good sense of a lot of continuity from the defense policy blue papers. There's a clear focus on the kinds of things you would expect Taiwan to be focusing on. If you kind of use that, I'm going to use the QDR basically as a little bit of a lens for the rest of the discussion. It first of all talks about Taiwan's security environment. And when you look at a document like this, whether it's Taiwan's QDR or the US QDR or maybe one of China's defense white papers, sometimes people don't pay a whole lot of attention to the security environment section because they think it's a bunch of fluff. But I think it really does say a lot about what the government publishing this kind of document thinks about the main threats to their security, how they're going to prioritize those threats, and how they see them changing over time, especially if you go back and compare it to previous editions of the same document. So this is Taiwan's third QDR now. And if you go back and compare the current one to the previous ones, I think it again kind of highlights in this part of the security environment the threat that China poses to Taiwan's security. I think it's fair to say that it expresses maybe some uncertainty about the direction of U.S.-Asia policy under the new administration. And I will now kind of stray from what appears in the QDR a little bit and kind of say that during the transition period, I think Trump made a big mistake by staking out a sort of excessively uncompromising approach on China issues, and that for him to kind of suggest not once but twice that he would walk away from the one China policy if he couldn't get a better deal on trade and so on, I think was a big mistake for a few reasons. One of them was it obviously put the U.S.-China relationship in a very difficult place as he entered office. The other one was, this was something where it was obvious to me he was going to have to back down from that. And to back down and make it look like maintaining a long-standing U.S. policy was some sort of damaging concession is not really the art of the deal as far as I can tell. So I think he created a situation also in which Taiwan might face greater pressure from China. Because if you think about this from Beijing's point of view, if they're unhappy about something that a new U.S. administration is doing in the U.S.-Taiwan relationship, they have basically two options. They can take it out on the U.S. or they can take it out on Taiwan. It's a lot easier for them to take it out on Taiwan. I think that's basically what they decided to do here. So putting Taiwan in that kind of position, I thought was a mistake. And also, I mean, the phone call with President Tsai, you could argue for or against, whether that was a good idea. But the statements about the one China policy, I think, from my point of view, were just unequivocally a bad idea that put Taiwan in an unnecessarily difficult position. Because President Tsai is certainly not President Ma, but she isn't President Chen either. She has her own approach to dealing with the cross-strait relationship. One that I regard as pretty pragmatic, and I think she is, she's not likely to say exactly what Beijing wants her to say. But on the whole, I think she's trying to suggest that she is strongly committed to the status quo and doesn't want to disrupt the relationship. And so having, hinting at or suggesting that there will be big changes on the U.S. side probably was, I would suspect, not helpful in that regard. So, but again, from kind of getting back to the QDR, well, of course, there's going to be some uncertainty when you have a new administration coming in that says that they're not going to participate in TPP, which was not just an important economic agreement, but also kind of one of the pillars of the U.S. pivot or rebalance to Asia. Trump's kind of approach to dealing with China right now looks a whole lot different than what he suggested it would be during the campaign. So I think there might be, it's fair to say, probably some uncertainty about that. And there have also been some, comments that I think certainly would concern people in Taiwan, such as when, Trump was asked whether he would take another phone call from President Tsai and said he would have to think about the difficulties that might cause for President Xi Jinping, and that in fact he would have to talk to Xi Jinping first, right? So that was about I think, frankly, the worst possible way he could have answered that question. It would have been a lot better to just, kind of